Night Vision. Following clues left by our ancestors, we unbury the past to reveal a knowledge of unfathomable value, putting us just a little closer to our own true birthrights. From the secret history of a possible bloodline of Jesus Christ, the secret history of America's founders, to the secret history of extraterrestrial interaction on our planet, here to bring light to the night. Your host for Night Vision Radio, Renee Barnett.
Hey everyone, how are you? Good to see you all tonight. I can't really see you. I can imagine that you're out there, hopefully, listening and watching. I'm excited about tonight's show. Got an old colleague and friend that's coming back on to share some brand new research. So that is always a good thing. And someone can come up with some new answers to add to the conversation, to spur on all the rest of us out there that are digging through all the mysteries of history and just trying to figure out what our ancestors were up to. So without further delay, I'm going to bring on my guest tonight, author, researcher, and television personality, Cort Lindhal. Hey, Cort.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Share some new info here.
I know. I'm excited about it. I know a little bit about it because we've been talking a little bit behind the scenes, but there is so much information that, as we were talking ahead of the show, what we'll do is we'll focus on a certain area tonight, and then we're going to have you back on. And I'm thinking, maybe we'll do a little series of shows getting through this material. And then maybe by the time we get through all that, I know there's more to reveal. Maybe by that time, that information will be freed up as well. So you're not telling it all, but you are telling it.
Exactly.
We're looking forward to it. So it seems to me like, of course, we're talking about everybody's favorite subjects, Oak Island and Rennes-le-Chateau, the Priory of Sion. And what you've done is you have discovered connections among those three that are pretty much indisputable within a particular document that a lot of Oak Island buffs and Rennes-le-Chateau buffs, for that matter, are familiar with and have heard of. So can you just shed some light on it for us?
Sure. On the Curse of Oak Island TV show, they talk a lot about Zena's map, which is part of what is known as the Cremona document material. And there's, a big debate. A lot of people think the Cremona document is totally authentic, and other people kind of take it as it was meant as a kind of Masonic quest or, lesson to be learned that was laid out and planned for those reasons. So what we have is somebody inferring that the Priory of Sion is also involved with the Cremona document and the Oak Island story. And I discovered this from examining a part of the Cremona document known as the La Formula document, which is interesting because
when you talk about Zena, we're talking about Zena Halpern,
Zena Halpern, who wrote the book, the Templar Quest for Oak Island, I think is the name of it.
Zena has something there. I don't think she knew exactly what she had, but it certainly has become something for everybody to chew on. And now it seems
the map is prominently featured on the show all the time. Yeah. And they're making, there's lots of clues and conclusions that they're making, with regard to that map. And this La Formula document was found with the map when it was found in the, sealed into the end page of a book as the story goes, that Xena tells in her book, how she and Don Rue found the map in the end paper of a book hidden, and the La Formula document was included with that. And the La Formula documents are also interesting because there's a little notation on it that says it was once owned by a man named Tim McGinnis, who is related supposedly to Daniel McGinnis, one of the original 3 young men of the Oak Island story. So the La Formula document does refer to the Oak Island story. It has a picture or a drawing of the same code that's on the fabled 90-foot stone that was supposedly found at the bottom of the money pit in the early 1800s. It had a code on it that said 40 feet below there's more treasure or something to that effect. So it's interesting that the symbols used in that code resemble Martinist symbols and coded symbols as well. And we're talking the Martinist Masonic order that was very popular in France, that even many indications are that Father Saunière of the Rennes-le-Chateau story was a member of the Martinist order, according to a lot of sources. They say a Martinist ceremonial collar was found in his belongings, and he associated with people at Saint-Sulpice and other people in the esoteric circles of Paris at the time that were members of the Martinist order as well, including, reported members of the Priory of Sion, like Claude Debussy and others, who was the Grand Master. That
I mean, are you talking about the composer, Claude Debussy?
Yes, who was supposedly one of the Grand Masters of the Priory of Sion at one point. So he ran in those circles, Father Saunière did. So it's interesting that the symbols on the 90-foot stone, and consequently the La Formula document, resemble Martinist symbols. And there's lots of examples of those in the videos I made about all of this on YouTube that you all can watch and see the pictures of. But
now,
if we look at...
We've all heard these stories about Abbé Saunière, the priest at Rennes-le-Chateau, going to Paris and spending time, and that he was, part of this, Paris esoteric society that, obviously included people like Debussy and maybe Maria Calvé, who was...
Yeah, exactly.
And was rumored then to have been in a relationship with Béranger Saunière, and then there was that stone that was found near Rennes-le-Chateau that had the heart carved into it, and it was like...
Right. There's lots of rumors about those two.
I believe that was fake.
I think it's possible in this story, and that's another thing you kind of have to accept as you look at all the evidence, all the twists and turns, and was the Priory of Sion a real entity, or was it made up later to match an older organization that was of the same name, and things like that. So there's lots of pitfalls in the whole story and reasons you could change your theory or what you were thinking about it. And the same goes for the Oak Island story. And that's what's compelling about this, is what we're about to see is a link between the two stories that's being promoted via the La Formula document. Now, besides the coded portion of the 90-foot stone, the La Formula document also includes a small notation at the bottom of it that it was ignored by anyone else who I've seen that's analyzed the document. So their information is seemingly innocent and doesn't really mean anything unless you are well schooled in kind of the nature of what's exposed in the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And that's how I recognized it, because I had read the book many times, and looked up a lot of the names mentioned to be associated with the Priory and became familiar with those people as well.
Wait,
So
Now, wait a
go
minute.
ahead.
Now, you read Holy Blood, Holy Grail many times.
Probably at least 10 times.
Oh my God, it's so hard. I don't know if you know who, you probably do know who Professor Robert Eisenman is.
The
He's the
name sounds
guy.
familiar.
Uh, he's the guy. He was professor at out in California and at Oxford, and he's the guy that snuck out the photographs of the Dead Sea Scrolls out of Israel and published them way back when. Then he was
Interesting.
like forbidden to return to Israel for a long time, but then they later loved him again. And but I'll never forget when he introduced me to Michael Budget, one of the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Michael was out here in Los Angeles working with me and my partner Bruce Burgess on. We were developing a show, and we went out to dinner one night with Robert Eisenman because he and Agent were good friends. Eisenman was, I don't know if you remember the story, but I think it was in the 80s. They took a crew from the A&E channel out to Rennes-le-Chateau and they surveyed the church with, ground penetrating radar or something, and saw that there were these, like tomb shaped or body shaped cavities. And then they dug down into the Tour Magdala until they hit something wooden, and then may or may stop and leave. So they never found out what was there. But Robert Eisenman said of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, he said, it's a penitential read. And I thought, what a perfect description. It is a tough read, that book.
Well, there's so much information in it. You might want to read it more than once if you really want to, dig in and get a feel for what's going on with regard to all the people involved. And that's how I was able to recognize what was important about this small note at the bottom of the La Formula document.
Yes.
This note was basically just an elegy to a man named Mr. Hayward, where it references, with great sadness and affection, we, lament the passing of Mr. Hayward, something to this effect. It's all in French. And, with great regret, he goes to the cemetery by the sea. And then it's signed Marie or Marielle at the bottom. You can tell that there's like an L there that was more faintly put after the E. So I recognize the cemetery by the sea as a poem by a man named Paul Valéry, who is mentioned in Holy Blood, Holy Grail at least 3 times as being associated with the Priory of Sion during the Claude Debussy era and the earlier era of Papus and the Martinist order, this kind of golden age of esoterica in France that, when Father Saunière lived as well, that all of these people were associated with him possibly as well. So it's interesting that poem was even referenced in there.
Do you think that part of the story or the legend is true, that he really was ensconced in this sort of esoteric society of Paris? Or is that
I think it is. I think there's too much evidence it's true, and especially if he was part of the Martinist order, as is indicated, that they were kind of the cutting edge of all of that kind of theosophy and, New Age thought that was prevalent, that even led to the later interest in it that the Nazis had. So
wasn't that
this was pretty normal during that period of time, but it wasn't normal for a Catholic priest to be involved. But given, what happened to him, what he discovered or what he got himself involved in, it's not too surprising if you take the alternate view that, he was working with a group, maybe the Priory of Sion, that was dedicated towards promoting the Merovingian bloodline as being the legitimate monarchs of France. So, that's the Priory of Sion, one of their purposes.
Was there, I know that the nearby city of Limoux, there was a huge group of different orders that were stationed there, which is kind of unusual. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a Martinist order at that time that was stationed there, for lack of a better term, in Limoux. Do you know if that had any connection? Was Saunier connected with that group? Did you find any Martinist connection in the region?
I didn't get that deep into it after I discovered all of this. The Saunier connections to that are just things that I've read and referenced from other people's work and investigations, that they feel that he was part of that. And one of the biggest pieces of evidence, as I said, was that a Martinist ceremonial collar was found in his belongings. So, and at that time, it's not unusual. There were all kinds of different, esoteric groups, some of them even Christian oriented, other ones Masonic, Rosicrucian, AMORC, and things like that. And I'm getting to a connection to the AMORC, or the Ancient Mystical Order of the Rosy Cross, as well, because, back to the La Formula document, the notation there mentions the cemetery by the sea, the famous poem by Paul Valéry, that, in turn, he's associated with all these priory members that we can almost assume he was a member or an associate involved in the same kind of scene that Saunier was associated with. But the signature at the bottom is interesting because it's Marie. And I looked at a lot of different people who this
is it spelled M-A-R? Is it spelled M-A-R-I-E? And then there's a faint L again?
Yeah, so Marielle or Marie. So I found somebody who was a Martinist, who was friends with Paul Valéry, that was part of the same circle of people, a man named Pierre Marielle, that was a journalist of the era. He'd written almost 30 books on esoteric subjects, including many of the subjects included in the Cremona document that he had written entire books about. That he had several pen names. He was a member of the Martinist order, the French Scottish Rite, the Ancient Mystical Order of the Rosy Cross. He was personal friends with Harvey Spencer Lewis, for instance, who was the founder of the American branch of AMORC. And it's interesting, I even found an article written by Pierre Marielle that was in the Rosicrucian magazine that was discussing some of the same symbols that are present on the 90-foot stone that are Martinist symbols that I pointed out before. So Pierre Marielle is a great suspect to be the Marielle who is referenced at the bottom of that little notation there. And he also associated with members of the Priory of Sion and some of the other groups that we're discussing here.
In that document where, it references a cemetery by the sea, do you think they're talking about an actual place, or is it just an idea or a concept that they're trying to point toward? And if you do think
there is an actual cemetery it refers to, and
is it in Marseille?
Yes, and it's where Paul Valéry is buried, and it's interesting. I always check, the find a grave, things that have pictures of the tombstones and everything. And somebody had left a stone with a circumpunct on it on top of his tombstone. So that's a circle with a dot in the middle of it. And that's another Martinist symbol. That's another symbol that's on the 90-foot stone at Oak Island. as well. So that was
I've,
kind of a freaky little find there when I finally identified his gravestone there at the cemetery
I've,
by the sea.
I've seen that symbol on Priory documents that, were shared with us by Nick Haywood that had, various seals and things, but certainly that was one thing that we'd see often was the circle with the dot in the middle.
Right. That's a pretty, common esoteric symbol used in a lot of different codes and different contexts, including Egyptian hieroglyphics. But it's interesting that it ended up being associated with Paul Valeri's grave as well. And as a little side note here, a lot of people who follow me see that I've pointed out lots of like weird hidden things in the movie, The Da Vinci Code, right? Chateau
Yeah.
Valette is where Jefferson and Franklin met with Rochefoucauld in a literary salon. Bezu, the name of the cop, is the name of the Templar fortress. I pointed out that Lynn
Yeah.
Picknett and Clive Prince were in the bus scene, the A Pope bus scene in there. And there's a
Did you
lot of
point
other
out
things like
did
how
you
the
point out
Louvre.
the Lee Teabing character?
What's that?
Did you point out that Lee Teabing in the film, Teabing, Lee Teabing is an anagram of Richard Lee and Bagent, Lee
Right.
and Bagent.
The
And then
movie's full of little things like that.
the
So
man himself was a white-haired man who walked with a cane, which at that time Henry Lincoln was doing. So the Lee Teabing character was supposed to be an amalgamation of three authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
sure, there's a Debussy concert poster at the Temple Church scene. It goes on and on. Now, what's interesting is the actor who plays Jacques Saunière in the Da Vinci Code is named Pierre Mariel, just like the same name as the man that I'm saying is responsible for that notation. Now, it's not the same person.
His real name, though, the guy's name is Peter Mariel.
Yeah, Pierre Mariel is the name of the actor.
That's about as wild as that. Our editor on Bloodline's name was Dan Brown.
Well, there you go.
And
so
people
it's just
constantly
interesting that he was
me,
in the movie, and I come up with association with that name. So that's just a wild coincidence. But Pierre Mariel is a really interesting character. He was like supposed to be a resistance fighter during World War II. There's every chance that he was associated with, Pierre Plantard, or knew him, or knew Robert Rochefoucauld, one of the most famous French resistance fighters of World War II. It's part of the Rochefoucauld family that's also really part of the story of Rennes-le-Chateau as well. They're directly related or descendant from Sigebert IV, of course, who in turn is descendant from Dagobert II. So the Rochefoucauld family is Merovingian as well. And they're related to all of the main families that are related to Dagobert II, including the De la Tour family, Lusignan family, the Plantard family, the Plantagenets, and so on. So they're one of those families too. So that's one reason it's interesting that they're so prominently featured in their name is on Xena's map that's featured on the Curse of Oak Island show, and other aspects of the mystery overall, such as the D'Anville expedition that may have deposited a treasure on Oak Island. So here, as I was emphasizing before, we have this piece of evidence here on the Le Formula document that infers somebody is telling us that the Priory of Sion is involved in the Oak Island story. Okay? And they're using similar names and imagery that only somebody who was conversant in these things, like me from reading the book so many times, that I would recognize the name of that poem, who wrote the poem, and then figure out who Pierre Mariel was at the end. And sure as heck, every step I went along here of studying the Martinist order, it all fit. That they were the ones at least promoting this idea, or that they were the ones behind the entire Cremona document, in my opinion, and association with the fabled Priory of Sion. So, I mean, there's more evidence, too, that links these two stories together that I've recently found out just from reading a few books. Like, this information's been out there since 1984. And I just came across the fact that, that Lincoln, Bagent, and Lee's follow-up book to Holy Blood, Holy Grail, entitled The Messianic Legacy, pretty much tells you who they believe has Saunier's parchments, what organizations were involved and associated with the Priory of Sion. They come to conclusions, and it was kind of interesting to me when I found this book that most of the fans of the mystery, or of the story, totally neglect reading this book, and it kind of answers a lot of questions. And one of the major things that I noted in it was that there's an Italian Freemasonic lodge, or used to be one, called Propaganda Due, or P2. That's P2. Famous for the quote, Vatican banking scandal. We're not going to really get into that, but we're going to get into their interest in the Priory of Sion and the Cremona document, because in the narrative that Donald Rue tells and Zena Halpern with regard to the Cremona document, that the Propaganda Due, headed by one Bishop Marcinkus, a bishop of the church, ended up purchasing the Cremona document from William Jackson, and had a hand in searching for parts of it prior to that. They had a great interest in what was going on with that. So in the Messianic Legacy, the Lincoln, Bagent, and Lee book, they squarely supply proof that P2 also includes members of the Priory of Sion, and members that are Knights of Malta that are also members of the Priory of Sion. So there's already documented solid proof linking these two stories together that no one else has ever pointed out before, that involves the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge and their interest in the Cremona document, and their interest in the Rennes-le-Chateau story with Bagent, Lincoln, and Lee pointing out with proof that they're members of the Priory that are part of that organization. So if they're involved in promoting the Oak Island story, just like the Rennes-le-Chateau story or the Cremona document story, then there's a common ground there that these stories of relics being brought to Oak Island are a direct result of the Priory, their assertion or claims that they have the temple treasure, for instance, or items included in the Arma Christi or the Arms of Christ, relics from the Passion of Christ, like the Veil of Veronica and other pieces. So it's also interesting that the Knights of Malta are involved. I mean, that is who they say owns the parchments that Saunier found. That they were the ones who ended up with the parchments, the Knights of Malta, or what their associates assert, what they say happened. And they say those members that were involved in that are also Priory of Sion members. So that's kind of the bombshell I have for us all, this time, and details that at least somebody is trying to link Oak Island, the Priory of Sion, the Cremona document, and Rennes-le-Chateau into one narrative, into one story that includes all of these. Now, is this the modern Priory, crafting a tale for their own reasons, or are they acting on knowledge that comes from the older original Priory? that there's
So
records of it actually having existed during the Crusades and for some time after.
do you feel that okay, let's take the Knights Templar, for instance. We know they really existed as a real order. There's plenty of documentation, and then we know now that there are lots of Templar groups around the world that claim relationship to the original order. To me, it feels like they're just reconstituting or trying to reconstitute something, but there wasn't a continuous line there between the Templars of yore and the.
That's a good point.
Right? So
the ones that have a continuous line are the Knights of Malta.
Yeah. Yes.
They never went away. They were never disbanded or anything.
Is there a continuous line? Can we show a continuous line of the Priory of Sion? Or is that like another Templar situation where we can up to a point and then it sort of fades out and then it comes back again, sort of reconstitutes itself?
Right.
What's original and what
yeah.
it on?
In Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they point out how it kind of faded away by the 1500s, but then it would kind of revived again in about 1620. And then later on at the end of the 1800s, another kind of revival where people discovered this concept. Maybe it was just well hidden or neglected, that somebody found out there was an actual one and patterned a new organization based on the old one. But
right,
it's interesting what you pointed out about the newer Templar groups, because there's the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem that today is one of the more popular, Templar groups that people join. It's not part of Freemasonry. It's a totally separate order. But in the Messianic Legacy, the authors point out that the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem has Priory of Sion members included in their organization as well. And especially the chapter of it in Sion, Switzerland, kind of broke away from the main group of that organization and may be involved in some of this intrigue as well, or the propagation of these stories somehow. Now, the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem is different than the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which is part of the Vatican. So this is not the SMOM, SMOM. It's the Sovereign Military Order. It's different. It's a different Templar group. The other group is also obviously associated with the Vatican and the Knights of Malta, and not the Knights Templar as well. But that's interesting. The association of the Knights of Malta too, because we see them having been active in all of the colonial era in which something could have been deposited on Oak Island. They were still in existence, and there's even interesting stories that the Knights of Malta used to own 5 Caribbean islands, including St. Croix. That when they lost ownership of those islands, some of the administrators were sent to Nova Scotia to work. And along with these Caribbean islands, there's lots of stories and legends of relics being taken there to be hidden and stored. So there is a rationale that when they had to leave the Caribbean islands, that some of these things could have been brought to Nova Scotia or Lower Canada and used in the churches there, or hidden for whatever reason. And what is interesting too is I found even in colonial Virginia there were these connections between what is known as the Archer Reliquary. That was an actual 12th century reliquary found in the grave of Captain Archer, who died in 1610, and he was a hidden Catholic. And as I looked into his family background, two of his uncles were Knights of Malta, with one of them being the Grand Prior of England and the other one the Grand Prior of Ireland. So those are like the Grand Masters of those countries. That, there's a pathway for a story saying that reliquary that was found that had bones in it and a lead holy water ampule in a little silver hexagonal box, that could have been originally one of these treasures that I'm discussing. So it's even doubly interesting later that the man who is the root of the Beale family in Virginia, a man named Thomas Beale, lived on St. Croix before he moved to Virginia.
Oh.
And not only that, he was a Knight of Malta.
Thomas Beale is the Beale treasure.
He was a Knight of Malta as well.
No.
Yes, because he was a Cavalier bodyguard of Charles I during the English Civil War. And prior to that, he was a soldier of fortune on the continent where he had become a Knight of Malta. So there are some English Knights of Malta, even though Catholicism was banned in England, ones that were mercenaries or that took positions in the militaries of other countries. So Thomas Beale is one of those rare Englishmen who also became a Knight of Malta, came to Virginia, and his family became the root of the biggest treasure legend there as well. And that's another story for the next episode that I'm on, because there's lots of indications that there's connections between the Beale treasure and Oak Island as well.
It's so strange. I mean, or maybe not, I don't know, and I do love the Knights Templar and the history of them, everything I can find out. I think they're wonderful, less so the Knights of Malta. And I think that's true across the board. It's like we do, generally give a lot of attention. People know the term Knights Templar. Not everybody even knows about the Knights of Malta.
Right.
Maybe that's by design. Maybe
it's kind of like kept that way and promoted that way. I mean, it's also interesting when you consider that, the Knights of Malta or Knights of St. John were given all the Templar properties. They were given all of the relics that the Templars possessed. I mean, and that's what most of these stories are centered on. So that could be really the only connection to the quote Knights Templar in all these stories, or their association with the Knights of Malta. Because every turn in this story and the development of colonial France, involved Knights of Malta, administering, being part of the military that supported their operations. So, and the same goes with Spain, with their military orders, Calatrava, and and Knights of Santiago were all involved in their colonial efforts. And to me, it's easy to see where that led to a lot of these assumptions people have that Knights Templar were involved, because the similarity in the symbols they used, and the fact that they're knighthoods and things like that people really just have this want or need for the Knights Templar to be involved in all of this stuff. And in my studies, I really dug in and looked, for facts that said all of that was true, and there aren't any. And it just disappoints people to no end when I confront them with that usually the only thing they have is something from a popular author that theorized this could be true, like the whole Henry Sinclair phenomena, coming to Nova Scotia. There's no real proof of that. It's just kind of something that's been repeated over and over, and they use the Zeno narrative that doesn't even really mention him as evidence. So it's kind of, for
Yeah.
me, I want to go and find out myself if there's something like that. I used to believe all of those things, like the Kensington Rune Stone and
Well,
the
you
Henry
want to believe
Sinclair
it.
story. Yeah, it's cool. They're cool
It's
stories.
exciting and cool. But
Yeah.
yeah, I agree.
One
We
day I just
we need
decided
to
to look
depend on
myself and didn't find any evidence. So
no, no, I know exactly what you mean. It can be very disappointing because some things that seem so exciting and authentic, sometimes turn out not to be, as I know only too well.
right,
But
right, and it's
exactly,
hard too because it's an interesting to observe that the majority of people that are interested in these things believe something that I found I couldn't find any evidence for.
yeah,
And to me, that's kind of mind blowing that if you talk to your average fan of the Curse of Oak Island, for instance, they all believe this is true. Fans of other Templar talking heads that always promote these ideas. Most people don't go beyond just, what they'll see on this radio show or podcast or a TV show, and they won't go look themselves. And I decided to
right,
do that and looked into it and couldn't find anything. That there's no real history saying this is true beyond somebody's theory that the runestone means Templar. That's just a theory, an
yeah.
idea with no real hard proof. You know, and
I'm anxious
it's an interesting phenomena
to,
to me to see that.
as you probably know, Cort. Uh, our night vision historian James Martin is uh, in the process of completing a 3-book series on the complete history of the Knights Templar, including, starting in Roman times, where the, conditions started to be set up for the Knights Templar to form and that sort of thing. And so it will be really interesting because he's so detail oriented. But yeah, no, there hasn't been, as far as I've read with, reading his manuscripts and drafts, there's not this connection that everybody wants to make. I mean,
There's no smoking gun of evidence, right?
Templars
It's
are
all
interesting
some
enough,
good ideas, but nothing real,
yeah.
you
And
know,
but the
pat.
Templar history is interesting enough on its own, but people always do try to. But you're right. People say stuff so much, they hear it, and then it just becomes fact in their minds. You hear so many times that some story, as we all know, there's so many stories that are just bunk that come out of these of these events, like especially Rennes-le-Chateau, because people I think have been, or at least the
Well, there,
people I know
yeah,
have delved into that a little bit longer than Oak
yeah.
Island.
Well, that makes a little more sense because there's Templar commanderies right there,
Well,
near
absolutely.
Rennes-le-Chateau, but there's none at Oak Island, right? There's nothing like
No.
that there. And I just, that's just my opinion. And no matter what I say, people will continue to believe the Knights Templar are involved. But I'm telling you, it's the Knights of Malta. And it makes all perfect sense within the context of their colonial activities, within the scope of recorded history. And that's another thing I'll say. All of this I do, I fit things into known history. I don't go intentionally looking to say this is BS. Recorded
Right.
history is wrong. A lot of people set out that way and they quote alternative history genre that they
Yeah.
ignore recorded facts and they only look at alternate information. You shouldn't do that. You
Yeah.
should take that into account as well. I look at the alternate stuff as well, and that's one reason I've come to not believe it as much. But even this newest information I found with the indicating the Priory of Sion with Oak Island is everybody should take with a grain of salt. It could be somebody just trying to make it seem that way to promote their own ideas. And I would point out that a lot of these treasure stories, like Rennes-le-Chateau, the lost men in the mountain myths of Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa, the mythology of the Jacobites. It's all meant, the Beale treasure even, to promote political and social ideas as well. And it's not that originally there wasn't even a real treasure. Like, it's perfectly feasible there was some kind of burial hoard of Dagobert II, for example, that later people then took this story and promoted their political ideas with, like the Priory of Sion, for example, promoting the Merovingian dynasty, which, like the Jacobites, the kind of morphed into this state with no physical domain that became so profitable for a group of people that they kind of lost sight of the goal of the Merovingian monarchy, because their business ventures had become so successful in secret that became the center of what they were doing, instead of the original purpose of kind of hijacking this piece of folklore. And in the case of Oak Island, I think that the story, the attributes I found have been some of the tags that have been put on that are making you remember the Stuart family of the fallen kings of England. And, Lincoln, Bajan, and Lee point this out too, using the term the Roy Perdue, or the lost king.
Yeah.
Is often an impetus for, a factor in many of these stories. And again, I would stress that they are real treasure stories. They just have attributes added to them that may lead you to, oh, I know what a Jacobite is now, or I know what a Merovingian is now when I didn't know before, on a basic level like that. And they're taking your interest in a lost treasure and turning it into an educational tool, if you will.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Now, you mentioned, obviously Pierre Plantart earlier, and he's sort of like the number one figure in the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery, aside from Saunier, because he was the one who sort of started putting the story out there, along with Philip de Charassy. And then in the same breath, you mentioned the Plantagenets. And I've always wondered, is there a connection between Plantard and Plantagenet?
Yes, it's the exact same family. The same root of the same name. So yeah, all of this group of families, I found this from doing genealogy, that the descendants of Dagobert and Sigisbert.
So the Plantagenets are Merovingian descendants.
Yes, exactly. Along with the Lusignans, the Rochefoucalds, and others, whose names also continually popped up in my research. The De La Tours intermarrying with the Stuarts, the other Merovingian family, and how the Jacobite movement of the fallen Stuart kings kind of sort of hijacked the same kind of concept as the Priory of Sion, with their shadow government that they had. They had a spy network. They had businesses working in their favor, while at the same time they had no physical domain, no state to manage or anything. So that's part of the phenomena of these two treasure stories too, that they infer, Oak Island and Rennes-le-Chateau, infer that there were monarchies or fallen kings that used these places possibly as repositories for, like, an off-the-records bank, for example. Rennes-le-Chateau could have been used like that, or Oak Island. So there's evidence that that's true for the Stuart family having done that. So the value of the
sense. I mean, if you're trying to hide something, then what better place than this vast new world that is so much wilderness and forest and all that.
Right.
I, you can think that probably they could never imagine what this would turn out to be with so many people in such a hugely populated country. But of course, even that area is still
Well,
still not.
this is, yeah, well, what it's all getting to is that the followers of the Stuart family, the Jacobites, had played a large hand in the creation of the United States. So my theory does involve funds that were once hidden at Oak Island being used to foment the early stages of the American Revolution.
Hmm.
So there are many connections I found via people, members of the Stuart family that are colonial, their efforts in America to fund these things. And they were even involved extensively in the symbology of the United States, the flag, the national anthem, the establishment of Washington, D.C., and so on. So that there's lots of evidence that I can cite that shows how Jacobites were instrumental in creating the United States, because in part they felt that the Stuart family had developed the colonies, that they anything that used to be part of England they saw as theirs anyway, so they didn't have any compunction at all about trying to take the colonies away from Britain and creating a new country that they were involved in.
Yeah.
In the end. So in the end, they didn't have total control or anything, but they played a large part in why it happened and the success of the revolution. And I think Jacobite money that came from the Vatican via Spain was one of the things that could have been stored at Oak Island, or was the purpose of Oak Island in that context. So it does lead, to interesting involvement of people like Benjamin Franklin, who actually owned land in Nova Scotia that he was granted when he was still an English citizen. And as this whole story unfolds, we'll see more of his involvement and other people and other Freemasons that had an influence on why I have this theory that it was the founding fathers that ended up with the money or funds from Oak Island, at least during that period. Now, the Stuart family had likely used Oak Island earlier than that. If you look at the work of researcher Scott Clark, who's appeared on the Curse of Oak Island show a few times, he points out how they were involved in recovering sunken treasures of the Spanish treasure fleet. The Stuart, like James II, for instance, funded an effort to recover a treasure in the Caribbean that Scott then feels was stored at Oak Island to keep it off the books so they wouldn't have to report that income. And that could have been the beginning of the use of Oak Island in such a clandestine manner.
Now, this could be way out of left field, but does any of this have anything to do with the so-called Confederate gold? What was the origin of that treasure?
Well, I think that the Beale treasure story and the Confederate gold have some overlap that warrant some serious consideration, that do involve the Beale family. And it would take me a couple of hours to explain all that to you right now. We're starting to run out of time. But this goes back to the, Thomas Beale, the story I told you about him being a Knight of Malta, a member of the Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg, where we have the legend of Bacon's Vault and everything that his family's involved in that. And that kind of has crossover to the Beale treasure story in a big way. And there's even connections in like The Last Man to See the Confederate gold has ties all the way back to the story of the Bruton Vault and Bacon's Vault in Williamsburg that are mind-blowing. And this is pause for cause for pause to wonder how these connections could happen. I mean, I even found that a direct descendant of Charles de la Tour, the first governor of Acadia or Nova Scotia, his descendant was living in Lynchburg when the Beale papers were released to the public, just a few blocks away from Morris's boarding house.
Oh
So
my God. You're just saying
that's
so
kind
many
of
things that you keep
it's
leading
kind
me
of
to another
suspicious too.
question. I'm dying to
Well,
ask you a couple more things, but we just don't have time. But everything you say is triggering me on
yeah, there's a
another.
whole series of these kind of treasure stories that have links to Jacobites, in turn, which, there's connections to Oak Island and stories like Rennes-le-Chateau and the Cremona document. It's almost like there's one brain trust that took these real treasure stories or missing Confederate gold, for example, and put their own spin on it, or they're actually really involved, which would be even more mind-blowing. If they actually had perpetrated all of these things and did actually possess these treasures. And I think that's just as possible as anything else. I'm not like totally saying it's all fake. It's definitely room there for it to be true.
That's
And
right. I mean, that's the crazy making part of it, because
yes,
you dismiss everything. You have to go through it like grain by grain.
right. And
Cort,
it
how do
always
people?
involves a large amount of gold or money, right? That's the
Yeah,
motivating factor of why they would also put a snow screen over the whole story, later,
yeah.
that they would
Cort,
create a folklore story instead of the real one.
how can people get hold of you, Cort? And I'll put it up on the screen.
Well, you can get me on Facebook. That's not a problem. Or check me out on my YouTube channel, Cort
Oh,
Lindhal. And if you feel like donating to my cause, I have a Patreon site for Cort Lindhal as well, and a membership area in my videos on YouTube that you're all welcome to check out. But there's well over 100 free videos there as well. And
ooh.
check out my blog. Just
Well,
word
I
search
encourage
Cort Lindhal
everybody
blog. And
to
big
help
parts of my
support.
books are for free there. So
That's amazing, and do check out his is it a Patreon page that you have?
yes, Cort
Check
Lindhal on
out his
Patreon.
Patreon, help support this continuing work, because
And
you know
obviously you can always buy a book. If you
absolutely.
I have 9 books, and you can just word search Cort Lindhal books, and an Amazon list of all of them will pop up. And that's be the best way to support my efforts. Buy a book, and I really appreciate it. And I
And
appreciate you
that's
having me on here too, Renee. Thank you.
oh, are you kidding me? I appreciate you coming on, and I'm going to drag you back as much as I can. We've already gone over time. Sorry, Bill.
Yeah,
I've done
we've
it
just done a
again.
teaser now. Now the next times we'll tell about the Beale treasure and all the other
Ooh,
details about Jacobites and the formation of America that we skimmed over.
that's really cool. So those of you who are watching and not just listening, I've got Cort's name up on the screen so that you can have the proper spelling. Just Google him, go to YouTube. Um, you'll find him. He's everywhere. So it's Cort, first name, and the last name is Lindal. For those
That's
of you
me.
who are listening. All right, thank you, Cort. Well, and everyone, I'll give you a heads up when Cort is coming back, and we'll continue this conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Cort, and thanks everyone for listening. Well, I thought I was ready to end, but maybe not. This is not good. Here we go.